it seems like, especially if you look online, we're getting worse and worse at having difficult conversations. But I think if we do that in the safe, protected space of the classroom environment, we also absolutely need to train our teachers well so that they can handle and facilitate that conversation, and it will work better if they know their class, their students.
All right, Dr. Laura Dell'Empio, welcome to Scotch College and welcome to the Range Project.
Thanks for having me.
So, Laura, you're currently an Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Education at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Prior to that, you spent several years as a Senior Lecturer at Notre Dame University here in Perth. You've completed your PhD in the moral possibilities of mass art in philosophy at the University of Western Australia. You're the co-founding editor of the open access Journal of Philosophy in Schools and a regular contributor to public philosophy outlets such as The Conversation, Philosophy Now magazine, the Ethics Centre and the ABC Radio National's Philosopher's Zone. Love that podcast. And the Minefield, another great podcast. Published extensively with numerous books, including the fairly recent Shortcuts Philosophy, which I'll talk about that with you a bit later on. And that's all amazing, and there's a huge range of stuff that you've done there. But what were you like as a kid?
As a kid, I was quite creative. I liked the outdoors. I was quite sporty. I was also a bookworm. I loved reading. You couldn't take a book off my hands. And I was raised by an artist mum, so I was always sort of playing with clay and being creative in that way as well. So I think that my mum was a pretty young mum and was always, wanting to have adventures and explore. So I had that side of me very much nurtured.
I'm going to pursue your childhood a little bit further and give you a few questions about that. Before we do, I'm going to hit pause because I want to throw you off a little bit here. And I'm going to give you some quick fire questions.
Go for it.
And we'll see how we go, and then we'll come back to my broader questions. If you had the power, which decade would you be living in right now?
Definitely the 1920s. I think the aesthetics of it, the fashion, the art, the decadence, ideally in Paris, the flapper girls, the music and all of that, I think would be really amazing to experience, and the amazing art that was being created at that time as well.
Okay, 1920s. If a museum showcased an exhibition about you, which 3 objects would be on display?
Well, there would have to be a drum kit, because in my earlier years I was playing music, I was learning percussion, and the drums were a big part of my life growing up. And there's a family link there because my uncle gave me my first set of drum kit that was his old set because he played as well. So I think that would definitely have to be up there. Then there would have to be probably one of my books that I've written, because that's something that I've worked really hard on. And, it's really nice when there's a tangible object that comes out of that hard work that you can sort of hold. And so I think, one of the books. And the third object would probably have to be a piece of art that I love. So it might be, I'm very fortunate, I've got some family friends that are artists and have gifted me beautiful paintings as I've grown up on significant birthdays. And so maybe one of those, just to show my appreciation for art in my life.
Okay, beautiful. In an ideal world, what does your typical day look like?
A typical day. Well, my ideal world would have lots of days that involve doing different things. So that's a bit tricky, because I think if it was the same day over and over again, like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, I would get quite bored. But if it was a really luxurious, relaxing day, it would involve going to the farmers markets, walking along the beach, catching up with friends and having good food, and then some Latin dancing at the end. So these are terrible, Sam, because you're finding out far too much about me.
Okay. Do you spend more time living in the past, present or future?
I try to live in the present. I've always thought that that's very important. but I absolutely want to have my cake and eat it too. I don't want to get rid of the past or the future. I think, happy memories are so important, especially if people you love have passed away. And you absolutely have to plan for the future, look forward to things in the future. So I'm going to say all three.
Good answer. Good answer. Okay. So you've obviously got a huge range of interests and things you've done in your career. What first drew you to philosophy, and then particularly the philosophy of education?
Philosophy was something that, without knowing necessarily that there was an academic discipline of philosophy, was always part of my life. I think I was always asking these big questions, reading books. I mean, as a child, I was given, the Tao of Pooh, which is Taoism explained through the stories of Winnie the Pooh. And so there were these kinds of conversations happening with my family all the time. But when I went to study arts at the University of Western Australia, I ended up taking a unit in philosophy, and I found, wow, this is how I think. So it was actually that I thought, oh, this is going to be really difficult. It's not going to be, a great fit. And what I found instead was something that suited how I thought about the world and the questions I was really, really excited by. And so that led me to study philosophy. And I began my career in academic philosophy. But one of the things I've always been interested in is how philosophy can be useful in the real world. And the educational aspect to it was something that came out of the PhD. So I was looking at what we learn from mass art, from films, especially Hollywood blockbusters. And by the end of that PhD, I decided we absolutely needed to teach young people to engage critically with these stories. And so education was something that, I ended up at as an important hand in hand with the philosophy. And then I found philosophy in schools and started writing about philosophy of education. But I became, a philosopher of education when I moved to my new job in England about 6.5 years ago.
And so you're in Perth now for a big conference around the philosophy of education. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the study of the philosophy of education for those people that really don't know what that means? And what was the conference like?
So philosophy of education interrogates some of the normative and evaluative questions about education. It's very interested in why we educate people and, if we're going to take young people, put them in schools and classrooms for, a lot of their young lives, we should have a very good reason for doing that. And so when we're looking at those sorts of questions philosophically, we might be interested in the aims of education. We might be interested in the limits on educational power, on curriculum. We want to clarify those concepts that we're using, making sure that we're talking about the same things in the same way so that we're not talking at cross purposes, and considering some of the important ethical questions around education as well. So it's a applied branch of philosophy, but it's not particularly well known. It sort of established itself as a discipline in the 1960s, and so it's relatively young. But philosophers who, of course, have been writing since we've been, thinking about things since the start of Western philosophy, but even the Eastern philosophers, they've always been interested in education. So education has always been one thread of what they've spoken about and recognised as important to democracy, to citizenship, to cultivating people, and to the life well lived. And so you can, look back and look at, well, what did Aristotle say about education? But as a subfield, it's relatively new. And the conference was great because it's great to have other people who are interested in this, fairly niche area and to explore ideas, and people come from all over the world. And we did one fabulous panel that you were a part of. You were on that panel where we did look at the aims of education and sort of discussed that and argued about that.
Yeah, and I felt very honoured to be sitting there with such amazing academics like yourself and Ning Kirkham, Chair of Philosophy at UWA. That was an incredible experience. I just wish I had a little bit more to say at the time, but I seized up, Laura.
You were fabulous. And you had a demonstration community of inquiry from your students here at Scotch that blew everyone away. They were absolutely brilliant. There were students from all age groups, and you didn't even need to do anything. They just ran that discussion themselves and had a really fascinating conversation
Yeah, I
that
was
we were able to watch.
really, really proud of those boys. I thought they just led that beautifully, especially our boys that have just graduated from Scotch. I thought that was, they made us all really proud.
But
those
even
kids.
the brand new to philosophy, you had a year 8 student, even he held his own.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he was impressive. Now, you mentioned Aristotle, and in previous conversations that we've had, you've mentioned how you've been inspired by the work of Aristotle and some of the neo-Aristotelians that have followed, and I'm interested in where in how important they've been to your conception of a philosophy of education and what matters in education. Why is Aristotle, first of all, so foundational? Is he foundational in your view? And then what have the neo-Aristotelians then contributed, on the back of Aristotle's work?
So I started life as an ethicist, really. I was always doing aesthetics and ethics. And when I was looking at ethics, I was looking at some of the main moral theories that around. And there's 3 that are very well known, very popular. So utilitarianism, which says we judge things based on outcome. Deontology, which says we judge things based on the action and the intention of the moral agent. And virtue ethics, which is connected to Aristotle. And virtue ethics was more appealing to me because we go back suddenly to this very old theory, this old idea, but it seems more relevant than ever before, because instead of looking at the actual action or the outcome, it considers the person who is acting. And it says we are moral, social, political animals. We have to live in communities. We have to get along with one another, but we want to live a good life. We will absolutely have different strengths, different ideas, different values, different backgrounds, but we are sharing this plot of earth, this land together, and we have to find ways to get along even when we disagree quite strongly sometimes. And so Aristotle's idea of saying, instead of what's the perfect way of making the right choice, he starts by saying, well, how do we actually make these kinds of decisions? And so he says, well, we're very much influenced by our upbringing and the habits we cultivate, and we want to have that good training. Education becomes important. And what we need to do is cultivate what he calls virtues, moral virtues, epistemic virtues, good habits of action that help us to do the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right reasons. Now, that sounds a little bit complicated, but to me it resonates with that's what we do anyway. So how can we improve those early influences and help people to make choices that will help them to live well and to live well with others? And so I do think it is foundational. And there has been a resurgence of interest in, as you say, Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian theory. And I think it's because it has room for trial and error, like making mistakes and then working at it and trying to, get it right, not just being perfect all the time. It has room for being embodied. It has room for the emotions. So with utilitarianism and deontology, which are often set up as the competing frameworks, they want you to be purely rational and cerebral. And I just don't think humans are like that. I think that we need to take into account that we have emotions and feelings. And again, how can we use that in a positive way? How can we be compassionate instead of trying to be robotic? And so I was very influenced by the reading of Aristotle through Martha Nussbaum, which is the second part of your question, which is that I think we also need to update these old theories. So while there's a lot there that is still relevant because it's about how humans are, we need to pay attention to the fact that historically we have excluded important groups of people. And how do we rectify that? How do we hear the voices of minorities, women, and make this a truly inclusive space? And so with Martha Nussbaum's reading of Aristotle, where she's come via rules, she's like, we need to humanize this, we need to contextualize. She's got this social justice interest, and she comes up with a theory of capabilities. And connecting that to philosophy of education, the idea that we're trying to cultivate these human capabilities, and we're just one part of the puzzle. It's not just schools and teachers that are responsible for this on their own, but so that people have the ability to live well and to flourish, ideally, then that to me seems an ultimate aim that we should be trying to head towards in whatever way we can.
Yeah, and we have these dominant theories, these three dominant theories, and then we have care ethics coming a little bit later down the track. I had a student ask me this the other day, and I couldn't answer him very well. He's in Year 10 philosophy class, and he said, "Why are there those four? Why are those four the ones, and there's not 20 that are the dominant theories?" Can you attempt to answer that question?
I think it's a pedagogical reason, to be honest. I think when we're teaching them, it's one easy way to divide and simplify. There are many more theories, and there are lots of different variations of the main theories as well. So, there's lots of different kind of contractarian moral theories. There's different versions of deontology like principlism that have particularly been useful in applied theory, applied spaces like in medical ethics and nursing. And certainly, then you've also got other kinds of moral approaches like existentialism, and I think they're a bit less practical, so maybe that's why they aren't always listed in your main three. But also there are non-normative approaches. And so it might be historical. They're the dominant ones that have had the most impact, and we can trace them back to some of your big thinkers like Kant for deontology, Bentham and Mill for utilitarianism, and virtue ethics, Aristotle, Nussbaum, MacIntyre. But there are lots more. And so he's absolutely right. There are more, and as you study more, you'll discover more of them and maybe find that the pure, original version might not be what you think is right at all. But also there's people who say it's not that people follow one consistently anyway, that actually what we should be doing is taking an all things considered approach and taking the strengths from each of them.
Kind of triangulating all three or four of them onto the problem.
If that helps. I've got some essays that I'm marking at the moment. They always try and take that line, and I push back a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, and so you've talked about Martha Nussbaum and you've talked about Aristotle. What about in the philosophy of education? Who have been some of your inspirations in that kind of specific field beyond those thinkers, maybe more contemporary academics?
That's a tricky one. I think that because it is such a new field, and because I've come to philosophy of education itself a bit later, the people who inspire me are actually my colleagues and my contemporaries in that sense. I love bouncing ideas around with them and seeing how, they put forward their arguments, and being part of that academic community which challenges me, which pushes me to answer their difficult questions, to admire their writing and to build on it. And so there are a lot of people, but the other philosophers of education who are at the University of Birmingham, Christian Christiansen, Michael Hand, there's lots of people whose work I admire, and I have the good fortune of working with them. So I think that what's been generative is being able to go to conferences and workshops and be invited to be part of panels, and then it starts to get more ideas happening, and then you work on projects together. And often in philosophy you tend to sole author, so I might not necessarily publish with all of these people, but we put together suites of papers. And one of the more recent projects that I was working on was on education to prevent extremism, which is a very topical, very contemporary idea, and we're bringing the philosophical sort of perspective to that problem to say, okay, what are some of the things that we might be able to do in education that helps to combat extremist tendencies? What can we do to promote, the epistemic and moral virtues rather than vices?
On that question, what kind of tools do you think we need to equip kids with to deal with the threat of extremist thinking?
Well, I think there's lots of different things that we need to do. And again, education is not the silver bullet. It's not the only thing. But in terms of what can we usefully add to that task, for me, it is about learning to get along with people with whom you disagree. So one thing that worries me is that people who disagree stop conversations and then demonize or dehumanize the other. And then there's increased polarization and an inability to share space respectfully with others with whom we might have, very strong disagreement. So I think that a democratic society needs to welcome diversity and different points of view and find a way to continue the conversation and get along with one another, even when that happens. And so the antidotes to that kind of, tribal us versus them thinking are to draw back in compassion, narratives. I look at whether drama pedagogy might be able to help us to consider the narratives that we're a part of and to consciously reflect on them and bring lots of voices into that space. So, teachers might be able to co-construct with students, and it has to be very specific to their context, I think. But then critical thinking, the skills that enable students to be well prepared to push back on negative messages that they're encountering, especially online, and find better ways of talking to one another.
Yeah, I mean, I think at Scotch we've got an increasingly diverse student population and an increasingly diverse teacher population, and so I think that's been fantastic from my observations, having been here for 14 years now. And so that's really interesting what you've said there. Spaces to have controversial discussions about topics that people disagree strongly over, and how you create the environment for that is quite tricky to do in a classroom.
Yes, so I think that that's really important. I think where it seems like, especially if you look online, we're getting worse and worse at having difficult conversations. But I think if we do that in the safe, protected space of the classroom environment, we also absolutely need to train our teachers well so that they can handle and facilitate that conversation. And it will work better if they know their class, their students, so that they can sense like there might be some conversations that they shouldn't tackle head on or directly. There might be ways of bringing a conversation into a safe space that is like through fiction, not through a real life example or through an analogous sort of scenario in another country, just so that the heat is taken out.
It's not so personal kind of thing. Yeah.
So I think we need to be aware of those very human aspects and work with our students.
Okay, so what about at the university tertiary level? Like obviously, I'm already thinking about better ways in the classroom as a teacher that I can bring about those conversations in a really respectful way. You think about universities now; they've, in a sense, there's a lot of controversy around university campuses. There's a lot of polarized debate. There's a lot of debate over what universities are offering students, and like university pedagogy that I hear about, stories of students saying at some universities that they're at there, the pedagogy is not amazing, and they're looking for more engaging and interesting ways to learn. What's your take on all of that? Because universities have come under fire recently for a lot of reasons. What's your take on all of that?
I mean, there's a lot in there to unpack. And one of the things that I will say is that I think that universities are really struggling around the world, and that funding cuts to them and the very real increase in the cost of living and other things like that have made it very, very difficult for them. What I think doesn't help is if they're treated as if they have to be a profit-making business. And I think that what we need to recognise as a society is the real value of education, and that includes schools as well as universities, that it really benefits the whole nation and all the citizens when people who are able, have the desire, the aptitude and the ability to go on to further studies, then bring that knowledge to enrich the place that they're participating in and they're living in. Which might be their own country, it might be anywhere in the world. And what we need to value is not just some kind of metric of measurement that is reductive and focused on economy or financial gain. There has to be a value for education as a public good. There has to be a value for qualities that are a bit more difficult to measure, aesthetic qualities, moral qualities, things that, again, enhance the lives that we live together. And some of these, might not be the things that make the most money, but I honestly think that in the long run, they are profit yielding. Because if you're healthier and happier and have a better integrated community, a more flourishing citizenship, then they, will support each other. There's, less destruction. There's less, reliance on other resources that, that they might need. But it's like when we consider welfare, we're not expecting welfare to make us money. It's a public good. It's a right. It's something that's really beneficial to give back. And I'm not saying that education should be free or absolutely, we can't consider, we do have to consider practicalities. We have to consider all of that. But we do need to just revalue the higher education institutions. And I think that one of the reasons, you mentioned that maybe the pedagogy isn't as good as it should be. The pressure on, fewer staff to do everything and to produce, the high quality research and bring in external research funding and grants, and then teach huge classes which are very, very international and, increasingly, hybrid. All of this is hard and a lot, and you have to require a lot of skill sets. So I think we need to reinvest in the universities and the staff and support them, and also recognise that not every single individual has to do everything. Some people are really good at this and some people are really good at that, and together that's, the teaching and the research and the leadership, all of that is really important and valuable.
Okay, and you've done a lot of teaching, you've done a lot of research in your career at university, both here in the UK. Now I want to sort of move on to your experience as an author. I've recently just bought this great book called Shortcuts Philosophy that you've written, but you've written extensively outside of that. What's it like writing a book? How do you conceptualise a book like that Shortcuts book? Maybe you could share a little bit about the premise of the book and what made you decide to write it, and how you conceptualise it from the start and go, I need to write that book.
Thanks for the plug. So I was very lucky with Shortcuts Philosophy, which is my first public philosophy book, because the publishers at Unipress, it was eventually published by Icon Books, they approached me. So I've got to say they had a series of Shortcuts, philosophy, science, psychology. There are other books in the series, check them all out. And they had an idea which I loved, which was 50 big ideas in philosophy, and each one of them starts with a question, and there's a short fire answer and then a slightly longer answer, and it's also supported by these amazing illustrations, and then there's concept maps and definitions and these kinds of things. And so I was then able to decide on the subject content, and I love starting with a question because as you know, in philosophy, in schools, that just opens up the reader or the person engaging with it, their ideas, their answers. So it's not just, here's what philosophers think about this topic. It's immediately, well, what do you think about this question? And then it goes into some of the answers that have been given to this question. And again, I think, encouraging that imaginative playing with ideas, with a beautifully illustrated, like a thought experiment or with a particular idea. And so I did come up with the classical branches of philosophy, where we've got ethics and aesthetics and philosophy of religion and philosophy of mind and these different aspects of philosophy. But I also wanted to make it contemporary. And so the final chapter is on philosophy of technology. And so we bring in some of those questions as well. And so I was just really delighted to be a part of that book.
Those philosophy of technology questions are really popular with my students. I'm not sure whether this is just a common thing across all high schools, but any questions about the philosophy of AI and associated questions seem to be questions that the boys are asking me a lot about, and questions associated with theory of mind and that kind of stuff.
I think that's exactly right. We have to engage with what people are interested in. And in the case of students and in the case of young students, Absolutely. Let's start with they're asking why already, or they're interested in games and all the technology. We should start with where their interest lies, and bring that out, encourage that, but then connect it to, there's this amazing old idea that you've never heard of where they were sort of exploring similar questions. What do you think of that? And then they are interested in, I mean, not just philosophy, but in those big ideas that expand our picture of the world and makes us realize there's different ways of thinking about things, and we don't have to agree with them all.
Yeah, I really love what you said about the space to play with ideas. My colleague Akram, who you've met, who's our scholar in residence, calls our communities of inquiry intellectual jazz. And he likes this idea of that, we need to maintain that. I imagine we need to maintain that at universities as well, the space to play with controversial ideas too, in an environment where people feel heard and they have a student voice. And on that front, I just want to touch on that community of inquiry pedagogical model that you're very familiar with and have written about a lot. When I first stumbled on that as a teacher, I was just blown away at the power of it. The fact that it was student-led, the fact that, when I survey my students in philosophy and I say, what have been your favourite assessments in this course, they always hands down say the communities of inquiry that they've got to do, more than even the research tasks or things like that. So they see the power in it. And I'm just wondering, why is that so powerful, that model, in your...
I honestly think it's because historically and even now, there's not enough space where the students have their own questions explored and their own voices heard. There is still so much of teaching, and not everywhere, but where, especially with assessment, the focus is on the teacher or, the marker of the exam has the right answer, and it's your job to say what that is, to figure it out, to memorize it, and then to regurgitate it. That's boring. I mean, there's a place for that kind of knowledge, but it's brilliant if they're taught how to think and given those thinking tools precisely by doing it. And so, again, there are absolutely directive methods that we can teach and point out, this is considering the premise or responding to the counter argument, and that's a fallacy. I think that should be part of this, pedagogy, but having room to just have the dialogue and learn what makes for a good dialogue is so important. And the thing I like the most about it, I think, is that a really good dialogue has charitable interpretation of other people's views. So you aren't just finding the quickest way to disagree and demolish someone's argument. You're trying to understand what it is they're trying to say, and you want to help them to say it, and then see how far that idea goes. And I think that collaborative aspect to it is so important as well. And as you say, you can entertain an idea without having to believe it, and you might disagree with it, but you can entertain it and then, practice that critical thinking. And so I think that is at the heart of philosophy done well.
That's a great answer. And you kind of anticipated the last question that I had, which was, what does a university and a school of the future look like, and what should we want in 10 years' time? What should our universities look like in an ideal world, especially in the age of AI and all of this technological upheaval and all the other upheavals that are going on around the world? You've sort of answered that to some extent, but how would you imagine those institutions?
I actually wonder if I can't imagine it. I think technology is moving so fast that I think that, we have to absolutely get on board and use technology. What I don't want is for technology to dictate pedagogy, to dictate what we do in the class. If we think there's some good things that we can do, sometimes it really is a case of, but computer says no, or assessment has to be structured this way because that's what the software allows. The other thing I worry about is the hyper-surveillance and tracking of students and student data and how that's kept and used and all of that. So I think there's some important ethical questions we need to pause and say, just because we can, should we? And how are we doing this? But then I am absolutely happy to use all of the technology, but I need a space for us to reflect on it and to engage with it critically. And for me, keeping those other values of aesthetic value, moral value, space to play, space to have a real conversation, to connect. I think that that's more important than ever before, because I can imagine the sort of dystopian picture where people are just connecting online. And there's a lot of good arguments saying, well, that's still connecting. That's not connecting. And I'm not denying that. But I don't want us to forget that we're embodied and to still have, going outside and just hanging out and that real joy of being human. I don't want to lose that. So I think schools have the challenge of balancing all of that and making good use of the technology, the innovation, the student-centered learning that happens with that, but then also less pressure on. It's not just about assessment and test scores and outcomes. Where's the chance just to enjoy life? And I think that's important to remember so that we can flourish, so that we can lead good lives. And the arts have to be in there for me.
That's a perfect way to finish. Laura D'Olimpio, thank you for joining me on the Range Project and joining me here at Scotch College. Really appreciate it.
It's been an absolute delight chatting to you. Thank you.